Welcome everyone, and welcome to this lecture about the reconstruction of the Union. And as the Civil War is ongoing, questions are going to emerge about how best to reconstruct the Union. After all, that was the primary war goal. That was the stated war goal for Abraham Lincoln and the Union, which was restoration of said Union. Well, the chief component to try to remember about all of this, and the chief idea to try to work out, is how are you going to do that? Even in 1863, across 1862, you're dealing with loss after loss, or you finally, at Antietam, have a draw, a tactical draw, if not an outright defeat, a tactical draw where you can announce your intention towards emancipation with the first part of the Emancipation Proclamation that will come into effect in 1863. You've got to try to figure out how to restore a union that has been broken, that has been split down the middle by Southern secession and all of the consequences therein. So first, how do you do all of that? How do you treat the leaders that are you're going to welcome back into the Union? How do you treat Jefferson Davis? How do you treat Robert E. Lee? Do you treat them as errant brothers, or do you treat them as traitors? And of course, in that line, we're not that far away from the point where traitors were hung, drawn, quartered, and beheaded. So what type of execution might they do if you are deemed to call them traitors? So there's lots of questions to ask there, and not even a few of them are constitutional. Okay, the simple act of secession and the southern states saying that they have now left the Union, are you going to bring them back in? How do you then do that? The Constitution gives you no guidance. And of course, at that point, if the Constitution gives you no guidance, then who has control of that? Is it the executive branch? Is that the legislative branch? There's going to be an argument, and that's where a lot of the fight in 63 and 64 in the Union government comes from. How do you simply admit these, and is it going to be the more lenient, conciliatory Abraham Lincoln in charge of the Reconstruction process, or is it going to be a more vehement and louder radical Republican Party and the small number of radical Republicans who want to see the South broke, busted, changed, and rendered into something different? All of these leaders need to try to address four key components and four key questions. If you are going to readmit the South, and if you are going to first assume that it's defeated, who's going to be in charge of the South? Who do you disenfranchise? Who can you trust then to take leadership positions in the South? Are you going to disenfranchise all former Confederates? Are you going to do that for eternity? Is it going to be a relatively short period? What are the consequences of secession, and how are you going to deal with all of that as we go forward? The other question, who's going to be in control of the federal government? Is it going to be the executive, or is it going to be the legislative branch? That fight is coming because across 63 and into early 64, Lincoln's presidency and the executive branch is becoming weaker. It is becoming weaker, and it is holding a very difficult position at this point. Now, success in Atlanta in 1864 with the fall of Atlanta and Sherman's March to the Sea is going to give Lincoln the victory, and it's going to give Lincoln a surge of popularity because you finally have that decisive blow. But we don't know that in 63. So the battle between the legislative and the executive branch is ongoing. Now, 1863 dawns and we give the Emancipation Proclamation. Now we have to address the consequences of black freedom, black emancipation. What do the freedmen and women, what rights would they enjoy? Are they going to be full citizens? Are they going to be half citizens? Are they going to talk about? And these are questions that are bandied about around the White House in 1863 and 1864. Are we talking about emancipation and repatriation back to Africa, or a colony set up in the Caribbean? There are a lot of questions being bandied around, And people in the North as well as the South are going to have serious doubts about emancipation and whether full citizenship comes following emancipation. So these are some ideas that are troubling to both Lincoln and to the executive and legislative branches. Now, the core of it is going to be that Lincoln moderate position of preservation of the Union and the resumption of it and the reunification of it and the moving forward with the Union and trying to heal, or the radical idea amidst the Republican Party that emancipation is step one, the Freedmen's Bureau step two. We're looking for, in a Republican and a radical Republican idea, the restructuring of Southern society, the redistribution of landed wealth, and of course, the giving of the tools of success to freedmen and ensuring that rights are, of course, fully guaranteed in the South. Now, those are two widely divergent paths. Not that Lincoln wasn't willing to do all of those things, but in Lincoln's mind, everything that the radicals wanted would come in good time, would come after Restoration, would come through a different process that would happen post-Restoration of the Union. Pursuant to that, Lincoln is going to put forward his 10% plan. Okay? He didn't want malice. He didn't want hostility. He wanted to try to heal the wounds of the Civil War and then try to make the world a better place, or at least America a better place, and try to ensure these rights and try to live up to the promises of the Declaration of Independence and make sure unalienable rights are enjoyed by all men. Now, when Lincoln starts with this 10% plan in 1863, he is ordering his generals to give very generous terms upon the surrender of certain areas. When we get into 1863, certain areas were already under Union control. When we talk about Tennessee, we talk into Louisiana. And at that point, once those regions had surrendered, Lincoln wanted to be very generous. Okay? By December of 1863, he's issued his proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction, meaning that we're going to start implementing this 10% plan. That as soon as 10% of the voting population in 1860 took the oath to the United States, that these territories under supposed Lincoln governments could resume representation and could continue to be considered redeemed into the Union. Now, in Lincoln's mind, he wanted it to be loyal rule. Take 10% of that voting population, let them swear that oath. Give pardons to the majority of Confederate soldiers. Okay? Over a certain rank, over the rank of lieutenant, you would not be pardoned. However, the majority of the forces that fought for the Confederacy would be pardoned, and we could try to move forward, could try to heal the wounds, and then Lincoln wanted to then try to change Southern society. Now, it's no surprise that Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas are going to have these Lincoln governments in place by 1864, and they're going to be considered to be redeemed at that point and brought back into the Union. These governments are incredibly weak, and if thousands of Union troops were to be taken away from these areas, they would have slipped back into rebellion. But nevertheless, in Lincoln's mind, as you're moving through 63 into 64, his plan for Reconstruction is effective and is moving and is ongoing. Now, there's no surprise that in Congress, there are a number of congressional leaders that thought it was a mere mockery of democracy, of the Civil War, and among them are the two gentlemen seated at the top, Thaddeus Stevens on the left and Charles Sumner on the right. Now, Stevens leading in the House, Sumner, the victim of a vicious caning back in 1857, is now back in the Senate and leading the abolitionist charge and leading the radical Republicans from the Senate. So these men are leading what we would consider the radical Republican, the extreme side of the Republican Party, because at this point, the North had really become a single party state. There are shades of republicanism, and Northern Democrats have become a very, very small minority centered on the agrarian areas of the West of the United States. So for our purpose, these radicals are proposing a much longer, a much harsher approach towards Reconstruction. And in their mind, Congress would be in charge of the Reconstruction process, not Lincoln. And in their mind, secession was legal. It had happened. Therefore, their statehood, and in particular Southern statehood, had been destroyed by secession. And if the North wins, these would remove themselves back and revert themselves back to unorganized territorial status, and radical Republicans can do whatever they wanted with these territories. That means rebuild them. That means confiscate property. To a lot of people, even in the Republican Party, the conservative and the moderates, this was frightening. This was unsettling. And so there's great hesitance about a government taking property from its citizens and redistributing it. What we're going to have to reach is a political breaking point to where even the moderates and some conservatives are going to side with the radical Republicans because of their anger. That's when we get to radical Reconstruction. But right now, these radical Republicans are going to issue a bill, okay, with their proposal. Lincoln is ongoing, acting of his own authority in his 10% plan, redeeming and bringing back Confederate states into the Union. The Wade Davis bill emerges that not just a minority, not just a 10%, but they demand a majority, 50% plus of the white male citizens, will participate in the creation of this new government, and those who are going to participate need to be able to swear what they called an ironclad oath. Now, that ironclad oath meant that you gave neither emotional, financial, or material support towards the Confederacy. Now, there's not a whole lot of Southerners that could say that they gave neither money nor service nor financial support towards the Confederacy. That's a hard oath to be able to take. And as such, the radical Republicans are looking to exclude the majority of the Southern slaveholding class from the restoration of and the rehabilitation of the South. And of course, anyone who served rank of lieutenant or above and had a civil or civilian office within the Confederacy, not only would they be disenfranchised, but they're going to take that a step further and basically strip you of your citizenship. Now that is again, and we keep using this word, that is a radical step to take, and that is a very forceful and daring step to take. But you've got to remember, these radicals are upset. They are very upset at what they see is a slave, aristocracy and this great slave power that is subverting the Constitution, subverting the Supreme Court, subverting the powers of the presidency as they had across the 1850s. And it's why we were here. And so therefore, they don't want them to play a part or play a role in the government moving forward. So we've got our two opposing sides. Congress is going to rally its support, and the congressional response is going to move forward with the Wade Davis bill that is going to be sent to Abraham Lincoln. And anytime Congress sends the president a bill, he has three options. He can veto it, he can sign it, or he can leave it, and in 10 days it becomes a law. Right? So he could just do nothing. Veto it, sign it, or do nothing. The fourth option in that case is that if Congress sends a bill to the president without the full 10 days for him to consider it and to do one of those three actions, if he simply does nothing and lets the term of Congress expire without voting yay, nay on that bill, that's considered a pocket veto. He puts it in his pocket and it just goes away. And that's what Lincoln did. Rather than veto it, rather than turn it into a fight, he lets the term expire, he does nothing, and as Congress leaves for their break, the outcome of the election of 1864, the outcome of the war, all of these are still very much in doubt. And the Republicans are looking at who could they put on the Republican Party ticket that might be able to beat out Lincoln. Because in their mind, that congressional versus the executive branch for control of Reconstruction, if Lincoln were going far enough, if Lincoln were acting according to their wishes, they might not have looked towards replacing him on the ticket. And had the war been going in a more successful light, 2.5 years of grinding, attritional warfare had taken its toll on many in the North. There were riots in the North, there were riots in the South. The war was taking an enormous toll on both sides. And so the Wade Davis Manifesto, following on from that bill, basically heavily criticizes Lincoln for usurping the powers of Congress, or at least as Congress sees it, and the disgraceful leniency showing towards the South. And this becomes almost a waving the bloody shirt moment. And if you've never heard that phrase, it's a phrase associated with both sides on the Civil War, more associated with Republicans as we start to move towards that radical Reconstruction idea. That you look at how many people are dead. I'm waving this bloody shirt of a soldier. We've got 500,000 people dead or injured. Who's going to pay for that? It's because of the South. It's because of slavery. And so we want something done. And so the Wade Davis Manifesto is claiming that Lincoln isn't doing enough. Now, they're unsuccessful in taking him off the Republican ticket. And as we move towards the election in November, Lincoln gets a great boon, good fortune, and Atlanta will fall in September. At that point, William Tecumseh Sherman is going to march from Atlanta to the sea, burning. That is the coup de grace into the Southern war effort. That they're going to start to be demoralized, and we're using total war on the South. We're burning, we're pillaging, we're plundering, we're destroying crops, we're destroying livestock, we're destroying their ability to fight. This is the apex of attritional warfare in the Civil War. Okay. Now, for Lincoln, the fall of Atlanta ensures his popularity with conservative and moderate Republicans and ensures his second term, and it basically then destroys the Southern war effort. The morale of the Southerners is weakened severely, not only by the Emancipation Proclamation, but now knowing that Lincoln was fully committed to 4 more years of warfare in order to win. And so what we're going to see moving forward is a gradual ebbing of the Southern war effort over the next 5 months and 6 months until surrender in April of 1865. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Lincoln versus the radical Republicans for the soul of what Reconstruction was going to be. Lincoln saw the 10% plan as an easy alternative. Do you want to fight to the death when there is an easy option to get back into the Union and end this war? If you corner somebody, they're going to fight to the death. But if you give them an easy option to escape, perhaps you can save some bloodshed. That was Lincoln's idea. Give them an easy way to get back in and then work on all of the other restructuring of Southern society in the aftermath. For the radical Republicans at this point, they don't want to hear that. They want to see long-term economic and political and racial transformation of the South. But Lincoln wins re-election, and Lincoln is going to have the gravitas to guide and to, in the popularity, to shape Reconstruction as he sees fit. And this is going to highlight one of the core ideas that we'll focus on in this class, is that the office of the president, if you're someone who can capture the public's imagination and enjoy a great deal of popularity, the presidential office can be enormously powerful. But during the Gilded Age after Lincoln, when we try to remember who these presidents are, most people generally struggle to remember from 1865 to 1900 who those presidents are during the Gilded Age, because they don't capture the imagination and they do not use the unbounded powers of the presidency to their fullest level. The power shifts from the executive to the congressional branch. And so we'll continue to talk about that as we go forward. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of the election, and as we move into 1865, we get the 13th Amendment. Okay? We get the Emancipation as stated, January 31st, 1865. It passes by 2 votes more than it needed for the 2/3 majority, and this is the formal ending of slavery in the United States, period. Okay? We're going to make sure that slavery nor involuntary servitude of any kind exists within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And then, of course, we're going to deal with that necessary and we're going to deal with that federal supremacy and does that constitutional power exist for the president or the federal government to ban slavery? We're going to put it in an amendment. We're going to amend the Constitution stating it. Congress has the power to enforce this by all appropriate legislation. So that notion from 1301 or 1310, that idea that the federal government can't bar slavery in territories, that was central to the Dred Scott case, has now been changed by the 13th Amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in those states deemed to be in rebellion in 1863. This takes care of slavery in Missouri, in Kentucky, in Delaware, in Maryland, all the territories that weren't touched by the Emancipation Proclamation. So now slavery is gone. A month later, they're going to create the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be relatively short-lived, but it is and will remain the most constitutionally controversial aspect of Reconstruction. In 4 years, while it existed, the radical Republicans wanted to assist the freedmen in all aspects of their lives to redress the imbalance that existed during their times as slaves. What we wanted to do was to give education, build schools, build colleges, supply food, supply medical services. The Freedmen's Bureau is going to branch out into a lot of other areas, in particular the managing of lands, of plantations that had been confiscated, and of course the negotiation of labor contracts, because if you've got someone who is an illiterate agricultural worker, you needed somebody to work as an intermediary to make sure whatever contract they're signing is not detrimental to themselves. And so the Freedmen's Bureau is going to have this broad overarching mandate to assist the transition from slave to freed men and women. Now, what kind of constitutional issues are there? Well, when we talk about confiscated lands, does the federal government have the right to confiscate this land and to redistribute it? That's a very, very tricky question. In the end, we'll see a lot of these cases siding on the side of the Freedmen's Bureau. But it also hits a larger question. And today we don't think twice about the social welfare obligations of the government. You know, we're living in a time where the government is giving out hundreds of millions of billions, if not trillions, of aid to companies, to private individuals, to small businesses. In the 1860s, even moderate Republicans are somewhat ill at ease with a government that has social welfare obligations to individuals, regardless of their former status. So this is where a lot of the controversy exists, and where a lot of the ill at ease moments come from. Even some of the conservative and some of the moderate Republicans are going to stand. In their 4 years of existence, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to do its best, but it will be hindered in a lot of ways by those that are merely opportunists, that are headed into the South to manage some of these contracts, to supply food and profit from them. We'll have a name for those people in the South, and we'll call them carpetbaggers that just come to make money off of the federal government exploiting these opportunities in the South. And it really does a disservice to all of those abolitionists and emancipation campaigners in the North who come to the South to really try to ensure the 13th and then later the 14th and 15th Amendments and the rights of the freedmen moving forward into Southern society. Now, unfortunately, as we move into 1865, we are going to see the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. Unfortunately, on the 15th of April, Abraham Lincoln is going to go to the theater, and he's going to be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Now, Booth is going to act as part of a cabal of men that are trying to attack all levels of the federal government. And in particular, Andrew Johnson was going to be on the list, but that attempt was going to be a failure, as well as the Secretary of State, William Seward. Booth is the only one that is going to carry out his assassination. And so Lincoln never really gets to enjoy the fruits of his 4 years of struggle and toil and effort in trying to bring the Civil War to a conclusion. And so his vice president is going to become the 17th president. Now, Andrew Johnson was a senator from Tennessee, the only Southern senator that when his state seceded, he did not. He remained in the Senate. Now, he was from that planter class in Tennessee, but he was often characterized as an outsider within that group. And so we're thinking that he might have harbored a relatively long-standing grudge against the people who may or may not have been part of his cohort and part of his peer group. And perhaps some of the reason of sticking with the Union rather than seceding with Tennessee was because of that. And while he was vice president, he had been very critical of that planter class in Tennessee. And when it was suggested that, you know, you needed to hold up a number of Confederates and we need to execute them upon victory as traitors, his reply was that, you know, how are you going to pick out so small a number when talking about 10 to 12 out of a group of so many deserving traitors? Going on to say that treason is a crime must be punished, and that punishment was death. So he says all the right things, but at his heart, if you remember from the first half of this class, he was a Jacksonian Democrat. Okay, limited government, hard currency, agrarian ideas, trading on that Jefferson-Jacksonian idea. Staunch Unionist, but states' rights, limited government, and a government that didn't involve itself overly in the state's individual liberties. So he does not have that expansionist view of Reconstruction, of the federal government that Lincoln had. He is going to be a much more limited and reserved president in terms of the scope and the purpose of the federal government. Now, along with that, he's possibly the most racist man to ever reside in the White House, meaning that he has decided ideas about the potential success of Friedman and Friedman's Bureau. He is going to be very much anti-Friedman Bureau and anti-Friedman civil rights. Okay? And during his time as in Tennessee, he had owned slaves, house slaves, and he was never part of that plantation elite. But he accepted the fact that his house slaves would have been lost as a result of the war. But in 1867, while he's giving his, what we know as the State of the Union address, at that point they just called it the annual message from the president, he gives a long-winded and scathing rebuke of virtually any endeavor that he said had been under Negro dominion and had come to nothing. In other words, in his mind and in his words, if you were to leave Friedman in charge of any endeavor, it would come to ruin. And that's what he's going to state to the Houses of Congress in 1867. This is when he is under fire, this is when he is under threat, and when he is at the peak of the conflict between the radical Republicans in Congress and his own ideas. So there's much to dislike of Andrew Johnson, possibly one of the worst presidents we've ever had in our American history. But I hear you asking, how in the world did he end up on the ticket? Well, we said Lincoln felt like he was in trouble across 1864 and needed to bolster his re-election campaign. And so in order to get those southern votes, or at least those border state votes, Kentucky, Missouri, you needed to appeal to some of those folks, and he thought Johnson did that adequately. But now that Johnson is your president, and Congress is out of session, Johnson is in sole control of the mechanism of Reconstruction. Johnson is the lone man in charge. But from his words and from his statements prior to about the planter elite in the South, people thought he was going to take revenge upon that elite, and he was going to live up to the statements that he had said. Unfortunately, we can look back on it now and see that he does not have this governmental interventionist idea for the federal government into the states. He doesn't want the government to go into the individual states and redistribute property and secure right. He has a much more limited version. And of course, he does not want to see new additions to the Constitution, stating the Constitution as it is and the Union as it was. Now, Johnson is going to take his Reconstruction plan and move forward. For him, Congress isn't in session. It doesn't come back until December. So over the next 8 months, he's up to his own devices. And he's going to say all the right things that leaves the radicals to believe that, okay, we don't need to hurry back. And it seems odd that for 10, 11 months, Congress won't be in session. It seems odd to us today. But you've got to remember, it would take weeks for some of these delegates to move from the reaches of Texas and, well, heck, we go from Wisconsin and Illinois and make it all the way back. It would take you weeks to travel along that. And so you're going to have this long, leisurely idea. Even if there was an emergency recalling of Congress, it still would have taken a month. But over the next 8 months, he institutes his own plan. And he doesn't say anything that would lead everybody in Congress to rush back. Okay? His pardon policy seemed to be very stern. You need to swear an oath to gain any type of amnesty or pardon. High-ranking officials, political leaders, any West Point or Annapolis grad who joined the Confederate States were barred. Were barred from an amnesty or a pardon. Okay? Any Southerner who owned property over $20,000 in value, okay, they were, again, barred. If you wanted a restoration of your political rights, you had to apply to the president. And this was a president that had spoken very critically of that group. So it seemed like Johnson was going to go after that class and promote, a new group of leaders, a new yeoman leader, small farmers, less that slave power elite that had led us to the Civil War and had subverted the government in the 1850s. Unfortunately, Johnson's not going to live up to that plan, and we're never going to really have a great explanation as to why. But he goes through the motions, okay, appointing governors, calling for constitutional conventions, and telling them, you've got to eliminate slavery. You've got to invalidate secession in your new constitutions. Okay? Only then can you ratify these constitutions, hold new elections, and restored with congressional representation. So you have to go into your state constitution and you've got to eliminate the word slavery from it. You've got to renounce secession, say it was illegal. And once you do that, hold your elections, and then you can restore people to congressional representation. But remember, only those who have taken the oath of amnesty, okay, and those who could vote on the day the state seceded were allowed to vote in these constitutional conventions. Okay, so that left unpardoned whites and unfortunately freedmen out of this process. You're going to look at this and say, all right, we still got a dispossessed Confederate elite. Let's see what they turn up. In 8 months, when Congress comes back, for whatever reason, Johnson was unable to hold to that plan. He does not follow through on the disenfranchisement of Confederate leaders. In fact, a lot of those Confederates had been issued wholesale pardons. It's almost as if he was flattered by or swayed by a personal letter, and prominent Confederates, including high-level Confederate States of America officials, are going to appear on ballots and win elections. The pardons and the restoration of political rights are going to really happen very, very quickly. And when we ask the question, what happens over those 8 months, when we thought he was going to be very punishing to the point that he was disgracefully lenient, the simple answer is we don't know. We don't know what happened. And we don't know why he was so callow and so lenient in the restoration of the Confederate States of America. Maybe he was trying to follow Lincoln's plan and get back to business as quickly as possible, as easily as possible, mainly because he does not share that Republican view of the need to reorder the South. But as December comes and as Congress reconvenes, Reconstruction is declared over in 8 months. December 1865, former Confederates, including the Vice President of the CSA, was a senator returning to Congress. Not only are they returning, but Southern representatives are going to be returning in greater numbers. Because remember, freedmen, when they were slaves, were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. Now, freedmen will count as a full person. So the representation of these southern states in Congress is going to go up. So not only are you seeing prominent Confederates, but you're seeing more of them. That's distressing for a lot of moderate Republicans. Of course, the radicals are going to be incensed anyway. The moderates are going to start to get a little bit aggravated. And then they hear tales about state conventions being slow to disavow secession. And instead of disavowing slavery, they're simply replacing the word slave, drawing a line through it, and putting freedmen in the law codes. A slave may not be in public past 10 a.m. Cross out slave and say a freedman may not be out in public past 10 p.m. A slave may not own a firearm. Cross out slave. A freedman may not own a firearm. This is not the equality, the enjoyment of citizenship and citizenship rights that so many in the North had hoped, so many emancipationists and abolitionists had hoped for. This is simply a new form of slavery and a new form of discrimination. And so for many radical Republicans, this was too much. This was the waving of the bloody shirt moment. No one had been held responsible. No one was helped by the war. So they locked the doors and exclude the Southern officials. And at this point, they're going to challenge Andrew Johnson for control of the Reconstruction process. And this is where we get to the issues here within the fight between the executive branch and Andrew Johnson and Congress. Okay? And because the Constitution had given you no guidance, you're forced to, well, look at the powers that were given to Congress. Well, you've been given the primary role in the admission of the states. And if I follow that conquered states territory, we are admitting these states into the Union. Therefore, Congress has an obligation, nay, a duty, to guarantee a Republican form of government for all citizens, freedmen and Southerners and alike, and that's what they're going to do. Now, radical Republicans are a small minority, but they have clearly defined goal, very unified of purpose, and what they want to see is the insurance of black suffrage, the rights of freedmen and freed people, and they want to put a democratization of that government in the South. They want to put that in place. How are they going to do it? Confiscate land, redistribute it. In their minds, an activist government committed to racial equality is what the forefront of the American government should be. Now, moderate and conservative Republicans are less content with the confiscation of land and the redistribution of it. And they are even less comfortable with an activist government. It is possible to be an abolitionist and still hold racial ideas. Okay? You can believe slavery is a moral evil, but a lot of abolitionists and a lot of moderate and conservative Republicans are less comfortable with the idea of racial equality. And that's the problem for Reconstruction. So as I said, the moderates, they're wary, but at this point, they're just pissed off at Johnson. Andrew Johnson is the obstacle. And so moderate and conservative Republicans are going to take that anger and they're going to use it to seize control of the Reconstruction process. But as we move into 1866, there is a potential for compromise. Congress believed that they had hammered out a deal. All they wanted were two modifications of Johnson's plan. Okay? Give us another year on the Freedmen's Bureau and let's pass a civil rights bill so that we could work in the South to counteract the black codes. That federal judges could supersede state judges to take any case in a state court, bring it to a federal jurisdiction to ensure equality and avoid discrimination in these cases. Andrew Johnson is going to veto both of these bills and denounce any changes to his plan. You can almost hear Johnson saying, "I don't know what you guys are talking about. Reconstruction is over." Meanwhile, the cartoonists of the day have a field day with Johnson. Here he is kicking and booting out the Freedmen's Bureau and avoiding any extension to that. He vetoes both of those bills, to which Congress quickly overrides them. At this point, we are in a constitutional crisis. The president and Congress duking it out over control of Reconstruction. Any hope that Johnson would cooperate with the Republicans in Congress, both moderate, conservative, and radical, is now dead. The newspapers are recounting on a daily basis in the North the anti-Freedmen and anti-black violence that is overrunning the South. This convinces all of the Republicans, both moderate, conservative, to join with the radicals and make sure that something is done. And that's going to mean more amendments to the Constitution and, of course, a seizing of control of Reconstruction from the president. It starts with the 14th Amendment. Okay? It's proposed in 1866. It's going to be fully ratified by 1868. Now, this one is going to be the citizenship on freedmen and, of course, prohibiting the states from abridging your constitutional privileges and immunities. Okay? This is the life, liberty, and property without due process, equal protection under the laws. This is the landmark amendment that ensures there is no misunderstanding about what the rights of freedmen are and freed women. You have full protection of the law, and it is illegal for anyone to take that from you. Okay? So, what else does the 14th Amendment do? These are the two biggest ones that we still hold today. But other elements of the 14th Amendment are going to be passed and repealed as we move into the 70s and the 80s. It is going to, by constitutional amendment, bar Confederate leaders from holding any kind of state office. Okay? And anyone who is disenfranchised by the 14th Amendment needs a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate to overturn this disenfranchisement. Anyone who held Confederate debt, you're just now holding very colorful toilet paper. The Confederate script is deemed worthless, null and void, guaranteeing, as per the governmental bonds, Union war debt is backed up and guaranteed. The 14th Amendment also is going to go further and specify for the first time as a federal statement, to be a voter, you needed to be male and of 21 years old. Okay? Ladies, you're going to have to wait until we get to the 1920 for the suffrage bill to pass and that amendment to be passed. Well, the ratification process for this amendment is going forward. Johnson is campaigning against it. And in the midst of his campaigning, in the midst of all of this, there's an election, a term election in 1866. You're going to see a Republican majority of 2/3 in both House, moderate to radical, a resounding statement against Johnson, against lenient Reconstruction. And as the resistance and as the recalcitrance of the South continues, Congress, the radical, moderate, and conservatives in the Republican Party seize control of the Reconstruction process, and this is generally what we consider radical Reconstruction. Okay. They passed a series of Reconstruction Acts, the first passing in March of 1867, and this is the official readmission of the states to the Union, and creating 5 military districts under Union generals, staffed by thousands of Union forces across the South. And I'll show you a map of all of these coming up shortly. This is the North forcing Reconstruction onto the South. The 14th Amendment is going to be held and enforced with troops. You are going to guarantee suffrage of freedmen for the state conventions, and hence you're going to see unprecedented levels of freedmen participation in state constitutional conventions, state governments, and even congressional representation as we move forward during Reconstruction. Okay. And while we have federal troops across the entirety of the South, you're going to require those states to ratify the 14th Amendment, draw up new constitutions, and submit it to this radical congressional body for approval. Over the next few years, the Second, the Third, the Fourth Acts are passed, ensuring voter registration, adoption of Constitution, administering of oaths against white citizens. This is going to be that step that will create the break and the resistance and the animosity between the South and the North over Reconstruction. And here you have the military districts. You see here in Texas, we're going to have General Sheridan with Texas and Louisiana, General Schofield, Sickles, Pope, Ord. This is military occupation. And across the South, you have 1 million Union forces really enforcing Reconstruction, enforcing suffrage. And it sounds like a lot of men, but imagine you have to have troops at polling stations in every town and every location across the South. 1 million troops isn't a lot. If you're trying to enforce your will onto the South, 1 million troops sounds like an enormous amount. But it's a big-ass South. And trying to figure all of that out is a very, very difficult job, made harder by a very recalcitrant South that has no interest in Reconstruction. But what we're left with is a very dire constitutional crisis where two sides of our government are at loggerheads with each other. Right? Congress is attempting to limit the president's exercise of his constitutional powers as we move forward. The 2/3 majority of Republicans and moderate to radical Republicans means they can pass pretty much anything they want over a series of Johnson vetoes. The first controversial bill they try to pass is they're limiting his military power, his commander-in-chief power, by requiring the president to issue all military orders through one man, the General of the Army, who is at this point Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant certainly is going to believe in the outcome of the Civil War and the enforcing of Reconstruction. And Grant is probably the only one at this time who has the popularity to stand up to and defy a president exercising his commander-in-chief powers. And hence why radicals in Congress are going to pass this law. Constitutionally, though, does Congress have the ability to limit the free exercise of the executive's commander-in-chief power? No. Hence why it's a constitutional crisis. Congress, for all of the right reasons, is stepping beyond the delineated powers of the legislative branch in trying to constrain a president who is very resistant to their ends. Now, they're also going to pass the Tenure of Office Act, giving senatorial power to not only confirm appointments to the president's cabinet and executive office, they're going to change that constitutional power to not only do they have the power to appoint, but they also have the review power to approve any dismissals. Now, Secretary of War is in the crosshairs of Johnson because he disagrees with Johnson and sides with the Republican view on how Reconstruction is going to be managed. And so we're trying to protect him by passing this law saying the president needs senatorial approval to dismiss them. Again, second violation of the Constitution by Congress. Violates the executive branch customary control over the dismissal of those that serve directly at his pleasure. The Reconstruction Acts and tenure of office and the General of the Army Standing Order are all passed over the vetoes of Johnson. So at this point, is Johnson the obstacle to a democratic government trying to do the right thing, or is Congress trying to become tyrannical and, well, hinder a duly elected president from exercising his constitutionally held power? Hence why we're at this crisis. Now we look back and of course we see the radicals in the Congress doing exactly the right thing. And the argument being sometimes you need to step outside of the powers. I got to violate a little law to do a greater good. And that's how they see themselves. Okay? Now, what does Johnson do? Well, he starts issuing orders through a variety of other military commanders. And if I can't fire you and I can't directly order you, you know what? I can start to retarget your powers. I can remove that power from you and I can give those powers to civilian officials who are still under my hiring and firing and direct commander-in-chief powers. I'm going to work around Congress. Any Army officer who is enforcing congressional orders, he removes, relocates, restaffs. And of course, everybody could see it, he's going to try to remove his Secretary of War, Stanton. Now, this leads the radicals in Congress to say, all right, we got it. Articles of impeachment are going to be drawn up against President Johnson. We'd consider them on numerous occasions across 66 and into 67, but the majority of the time they had been defeated by the House. The third motion of impeachment in the House following his attempt to dismiss Stanton carries easily, and in early 1868 the president is put on trial for high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the constitutional standard of, can we get rid of a president? Does anything that Johnson does anything that Johnson has done constitute high crimes and misdemeanors? Unfortunately, no. The Senate ultimately will reject the case against Johnson for impeachment by one vote. He is impeached, or articles passed. He is not convicted, so he hits a very dubious club in American presidential history of impeached but not convicted presidents. So he remains president to serve out the rest of his term through 1868, but he is politically crippled. He is a lame duck. And it's about this time that we start to look for the election of 1868. Now, who's running? Well, we've got our good man, the hero of the Northern War effort, Ulysses S. Grant, running against a difficult to support Northern Democratic candidate of Horatio Seymour. Grant's going to easily win on congressional reconstruction and the insurance of freedmen's suffrage. Now, Grant is one of the most fascinating figures in American history. Subject of great biographies and the subject of a lot of introspection that we really don't have the time to really dig into. As a military leader, he is extremely talented. As a student, poor. As a president, corrupt. And as far as Reconstruction goes, he's a military man who's never fully committed to military rule in the South. Grant is going to trust his friends blindly, and they will take advantage of it. When we talk about the Gilded Age, we'll talk about Grant's administration as one of the most corrupt in American history. Right? And that's saying something with some of the presidents that we've had and some of the sweetheart deals that we've had with some of these presidents. There's going to be a series of rings and a series of corruption and just unprecedented levels of mismanagement of funds under Grant. The irony is, of course, that he died penniless and broke. However, Grant is a military man. He's good at fighting wars, and he doesn't view the military as an agent for policing of the American state. And he doesn't see the Army as the tool that needs to redistribute wealth or to, well, really tear down the South and build it again. And as such, he would support certain issues vehemently. He would relent on others. He, as is standard in American history, post-war, you furlough the military, which meant within a year, the Union forces in the South goes from 1 million to 57,000 troops. So 1870, there's 57,000 troops in the South. They're charged with enforcing the 14th and then later the 15th Amendment. That is just brutally impossible. And by the time we get to 1874, 5 years after he fully takes office, there's less than 4,000 troops in the South outside of Texas. And in Texas, they're fighting Comanches, they're fighting Native Americans, they're fighting on those frontiers. This is where a lot of the failure of Reconstruction resides in Grant's presidency. Now, we also get the capstone of our constitutional amendments at this point. We get in 1870, we get the 15th Amendment, proposed in 69, quickly ratified. And this one prohibits the denial of anyone's right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So in a lot of people's minds, freedmen, well, it's illegal now to deny you the right to vote based on race, based on color, based on condition of servitude. Well, that's great. But I can come up with a hell of a lot of other opportunities to deny people the right to vote. Can I do a literacy test? Can I do a grandfather clause? Can I do a poll tax? And of course, we can always exclude women from their right to vote. And so we have a lot of criteria that we can deny the rights of vote. In the South, when they start really moving actively towards this, they're going to get real creative on this. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. But with the passage of the 15th Amendment, many people in the North are going to consider Reconstruction over. And there's a very famous headline from the New York Tribune in April 1870 that said, "Let us have done with Reconstruction." And to many people, you've now prohibited slavery, we've ensured civil rights, and we've ensured the right to vote. That's got to be job done, right? That's got to be job done. But many abolitionists are going to be very, very worried about the job that has left unfinished. We've not redressed any of the social or the economic inequities, the educational inequities that are rampant in the South. And therefore, abolitionists in particular are going to be very, very worried about the job that has been left undone, an unfinished business. And this is where we get to the real failure of Reconstruction. As we move into 68 and 69, you're going to see a very, very tough economic downturn that will continue into the 1870s. And when economic hard times are afoot, and we'll even call this a depression of 1873, people get distracted, easily distracted. Okay? The hostility towards freedmen and the terror wrought by the Klan and other groups in the South will really bring down a lot of these Republican governments in the South. For as much of the backlash of Southern states and the talk and the angst and the discussion and the anger over it, radical Reconstruction in a lot of these states really only lasts a few years. Once the troops are gone, you're left with no mechanism to redress the political, the social, and the economic sources of inequality. Reconstruction did not redistribute the land, did not equip freedmen with economic independence, and they did not change in any way, shape, or form the social structure. You gave freedmen the right to vote, which is true, but you gave them no land, you gave them no skills, you gave them no money with which to maintain that equality. And at that point, freedmen are going to be left at the mercy of those who could have possibly been their former masters. And without land and no skills, you really are going to be left in a worse situation economically than you might have been before. And once the Freedmen's Bureau ends and the government support ends, you're left out in the cold. Okay. For Reconstruction, as we move forward, it's going to be quickly reversed. New issues are going to capture the attentions of the North. Redeemer Democrats are slowly going to oust Republicans. And as we move forward, the South is going to craft this idea of Negro domination, that during radical Reconstruction, white Southerners were under the thumb of Negro rule. It is completely untrue. But for the South, they're going to craft their own narrative. They're going to craft their own idea that suits their agenda. And so as the Redeemers start to reclaim governments, anything associated with Republican government is going to be thrown out. Texas, at one point, the Republican governor of Texas had a state police wherein he employed both white and freedmen troopers. That state police, the moment Democrats get control of Texas, is thrown out. Hence, for the longest time, why we still have a Department of Public Safety instead of a state police. Because of that illogical backlash. The election of 1872 sees Grant win a second term, but Grant is really just running on reputation as being a war hero and very little else. The consequence of the reversal of the Three-Fifths Compromise and an increase in representation in the South means that Democrats in 1874 capture the House. Congress had already lifted by 1874 the majority of the disenfranchisements as per the 14th Amendment, and 1872 and the Amnesty Act therein pardons the majority so that really you're only left with about 500 Confederates who are no longer able to be politically active. By 1872, 4 state governments are in Democratic hands, and by 1876, 8 of the 11 Southern governments are in Democratic hands. And of course, the Democrats are going to highlight the failures of Reconstruction, the scandals of Reconstruction, to use public opinion to reverse Republican rule and to really wear people out. And again, if you hear the same story day after day, there's a certain amount of fatigue that sets in. And when Northerners have more pressing issues at home, like immigration, urbanization, industrialization, westward expansion, Reconstruction and what's happening in the South becomes a distant memory. And that's where the real failure is, because America will get distracted and America will stop paying attention. The next time America looks at the South and what's happening in the South, it's 1946. And they realize they've missed out on 60 years of Jim Crow and have failed to protect the freedmen that they worked so hard to emancipate. But the election of 1876 sees the final coup de grace of Reconstruction reversed. Rutherford B. Hayes, here pictured, is going to run against Samuel Tilden. Now, Rutherford and Tilden are going to run a very close race, and the election is going to be disputed in the 3 states that are still in the hands of Republican governments. Those are, of course, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. And ironically, those are the allegations of, on both sides, we won, no, we won, you committed fraud, no, you committed fraud. Goodness, sound familiar? What's going to happen at this point is the Republican governments declare for Tilden. Sorry, forgive me. The Republican governments are going to declare for Hayes. The Democrats, of course, are going to protest and say the Republicans are engaging themselves in fraud. The Democrats won these elections. Those states, those 3 states, should be awarded to Tilden. Now, the reason it becomes a crisis and the reason it becomes important is because the election was so close. If those 3 states, as the Republican governments declare for Hayes, that gives Hayes the presidency. If those 3 states declare for Tilden, as the Democrats would allege and accept that fraud, that would give Tilden the election. All right. Now, both sides alleging, how do we solve this? Well, we select a committee to investigate the religion, or to investigate the election and the alleged fraud. That commission is going to be made up and reflect the composition of both houses of Congress. As it stood, a 15-man commission would have 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. And each time they call for a vote, it's going to go straight party line. So at this point, the Democrats realize they cannot win, and they accept a Republican president, Rutherford B. Hayes. This becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. And Rutherford is going to be forever known at that point as Rutherfraud B. Hayes. I always thought that was a really good one. Rutherfraud B. Hayes gets the presidency. In return, Democrats drop their challenge because it's always going to be voted down party lines, and it's non-negotiable because of the composition of both the House and the Senate would return always 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats. So they extract the removal of those last 4,000 troops from the South. They get more federal aid for internal improvements, roads, bridges, railroads, and that's it. Reconstruction is going to be over. And so when you look at it, we have to look and we say, what did it accomplish? Well, it increased the federal power, set a precedent that, however limited for however number of years, the federal government can go into the individual states and make radical changes. That's going to be important as we move forward into the progressive era. Stay tuned for that one. It is going to try to heal some of the binds or some of the wounds of the Civil War, but of course the Deep South, it's almost going to drive themselves together into that core of the solid South, from Texas to South Carolina. They will vote as a bloc for the next 100 years. And a Republican will not be returned from that bloc, period. Hence the regional limitations. What we do see is sweeping use of that federal power with interventionist policies in southern states. That is going to make some people uncomfortable in America because we have a very narrow view about what America should be, what America's role and the government's role is in everybody's day-to-day life. It is very much a hands-off view. If President Lincoln saw the federal government today and the way that it is involved in your day-to-day life, in almost every facet of your life, they would be shocked and astonished at how pervasive the federal government has become. And of course, it also gives us the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. These are our landmark amendments. So the Reconstruction does a few things. Unfortunately, it does not follow through with those amendments. It does not resolve the issues. And the moment those federal troops are gone is the moment that everything is going to be reversed. It is a legacy of a failure to equip freedmen with economic, political, or social equality to guarantee that freedman status. And then when you go and you look at industrialization, and you look at expansion, and you look at everything else, the freedmen are left at the mercy of white Southerners who are at this point incredibly angry and resentful and embittered by what they see as having Reconstruction foisted upon them by a North that they're going to resent heavily. And we'll continue to talk about that resistance. We'll see it manifest itself in Jim Crow. We'll see it manifest itself in segregationist policies as we talk about the Gilded Age. And we'll continue to talk about that moving forward. But for now, that's the end of Reconstruction. When we pick up next time, we'll talk about westward expansion and all of the other factors that are going to start to distract the North from what's happening in the South. And driving us in our inevitable manifest destiny push further and further west.